By the winter of 1776, the American Revolution was not rising. It was fading, not in a single catastrophic defeat, not in one decisive battle, but quietly through exhaustion, doubt, and the slow erosion of belief. What had begun the previous year as a bold challenge to imperial authority was now approaching its most dangerous moment. The early confidence of rebellion had been replaced by cold reality. Armies had scattered. Supplies had vanished. Hope itself had become a scarce resource. Across the countryside, ordinary people were asking the same question, often in silence. Was independence ever truly possible? This is not the story of a nation marching confidently toward destiny. It is the story of a revolution that nearly failed, saved not by overwhelming strength, but by a single desperate decision made when defeat seemed all but certain. In the winter of 1776, the future of the United States did not rest on grand speeches or distant ideals. It rested on a freezing river, a shrinking army, and a gamble that history would later call improbable but not inevitable. To understand why the Battle of Trenton mattered, we must begin not with victory, but with collapse. By December of 1776, the Continental Army was barely holding together. Just months earlier, many Americans had believed the war might be short. The Declaration of Independence had transformed resistance into revolution, and for a moment, the cause seemed energized by clarity and purpose. But declarations do not win wars. Armies do. And by the end of the year, the American army was losing. The defeats had come in rapid succession. On Long Island, the British had demonstrated the full power of professional warfare. At White Plains, American forces failed to halt the advance. At Fort Washington, thousands were captured in a single blow. Each loss carried consequences beyond the battlefield. Soldiers deserted. Militias returned home. Confidence drained away. What remained of the Continental Army retreated across New Jersey, step by step, pursued by British forces that appeared increasingly unstoppable. Towns that had once welcomed the revolution now hesitated. Some closed their doors. Others openly shifted allegiance. The revolution was not being crushed, it was being abandoned. More alarming than battlefield losses was the calendar. Most enlistments in the Continental Army expired on December 31st. In just days, thousands of soldiers would legally be free to leave, and many intended to do exactly that. They had enlisted to defend their homes, not to endure endless retreat in freezing rain, unpaid and ill-equipped. Washington knew this reality better than anyone. He did not command an army of career soldiers. He led farmers, laborers, shopkeepers' men, whose loyalty depended not on discipline, but on belief. And belief was slipping away. There were moments, late at night, when even senior officers questioned whether the struggle could continue. Supplies were inadequate. Ammunition was scarce. Disease spread quickly in crowded camps. Winter offered no relief, only hardship. Across the river, the British saw a different picture. From their perspective, the rebellion was nearing its natural end. British commanders believed they had broken the main American force. Rather than risk unnecessary engagements in winter conditions, they shifted to consolidation. Their strategy was measured, methodical, and confident. British troops settled into winter quarters across New Jersey, supported by German auxiliary forces known collectively as Hessians. These soldiers were professionals, experienced in European warfare, and accustomed to restoring order after failed uprisings. To them, this rebellion appeared no different. The assumption was simple: the Americans were finished. It was at this precise moment, when defeat felt not dramatic but inevitable, that a short pamphlet began circulating among the troops. Its opening line cut through the cold with startling clarity. "These are the times that try men's souls." The author was Thomas Paine. The message was not triumphal. It did not promise victory. Instead, it acknowledged suffering, fear, and doubt, then asked a harder question. What kind of commitment survives when success is no longer assured? For Washington, this question was not philosophical. It was operational. He understood that if nothing changed, if the army simply endured the winter, the revolution would not survive until spring. The cause would dissolve, not with a final battle, but with a quiet return to ordinary life under British rule. There was only one way forward. Something had to happen. Something bold enough to restore belief. Something risky enough to change the narrative of inevitable defeat. Washington did not need a large victory. He needed a meaningful one. And so, as the year drew to a close, with the army shrinking and morale at its lowest point, he began to consider an option that many would later describe as reckless: a winter attack. At night, across an ice-choked river. Not because it was safe, but because it was unexpected. The decision that followed would place the entire revolution on a single roll of the dice. And in doing so, it would reveal a truth that echoes through American history to this day. That the fate of nations is often decided not when conditions are favorable, but when leaders choose to act despite the odds. Night fell early on Christmas Day. Not the quiet, gentle darkness of celebration, but a heavy winter night, thick with wind and sleet, pressing down on the banks of the Delaware River. The temperature dropped steadily as daylight disappeared, and with it, any remaining sense of comfort. This was the moment. By late afternoon, the Continental Army began to assemble near the river. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, no music, only muffled orders and the sound of boots moving through frozen ground. The men understood what was being asked of them. They were not marching into a conventional battle. They were being asked to cross a wide river in darkness, through ice and storm, carrying weapons, ammunition, and artillery, then immediately march toward an enemy garrison believed to be stronger, better trained, and fully capable of destroying them. There would be no retreat once the crossing began. The river itself was the first obstacle. The Delaware was not frozen solid. Large sheets of ice drifted unpredictably in the current, colliding, breaking apart, reforming without warning. Any miscalculation could capsize a boat. Any delay increased the risk of exposure and exhaustion. Specialized riverboats, designed to carry heavy loads, were brought forward. One by one, soldiers stepped aboard, balancing muskets and packs while gripping the sides against the cold. Artillery followed. Moving cannons across a river in winter was an extraordinary undertaking. Each piece had to be maneuvered carefully, lowered, stabilized, and ferried across without tipping or sliding into the water. The process was slow, painfully slow. As the hours passed, the weather worsened. Rain turned to sleet. Sleet turned to snow. Wind cut through wool coats and soaked linen uniforms. Fingers stiffened, muscles cramped. The night offered no mercy. The original plan had been precise. The crossing was supposed to be completed well before midnight. The march would begin under cover of darkness. The attack would come at dawn. But nothing went according to schedule. The crossing dragged on for hours longer than expected. By midnight, the river was still crowded with ice. By 2 in the morning, men were still boarding boats. By 4, it was clear that the timetable had collapsed. 2 supporting forces, assigned to cross at different points, never made it across at all. Ice and current proved too dangerous. Orders were given to stand down. Those units would play no role in what followed. Crucially, the main force did not know this. The army that completed the crossing did so under the assumption that it was part of a larger, coordinated operation. In reality, it was now alone. By the time the last cannon reached the far bank, nearly 9 hours had passed since the operation began. Dawn was approaching. There was no opportunity to reconsider, no chance to delay. To turn back now would mean retreating without action, an outcome that would confirm everything the men already feared. So the order was given. The march would proceed. Wet, exhausted, and already behind schedule, the army formed into columns and moved away from the river, disappearing into the storm. What followed was not a march in the traditional sense. It was a test of endurance. Snow mixed with freezing rain, blinding men and soaking their clothing. Roads turned to mud beneath a thin crust of ice. Every step required effort. Every breath burned the lungs. Many soldiers had wrapped rags around their feet where shoes had long since failed. With each mile, the cloth froze stiff, cutting into skin. Blood stained the snow behind them, not dramatically, but steadily. Officers moved among the ranks, encouraging, urging, sometimes simply walking beside men who could no longer speak. The silence was broken only by wind, by coughing, by the distant creak of wagons struggling behind the columns. There was a deeper fear beneath the physical suffering. The fear that the effort might be meaningless. Muskets, exposed to hours of wet weather, were unreliable. Powder could be damp. Flint could fail. If weapons did not fire, the men would be forced into close combat against trained professionals, something many had never experienced. As the columns pressed forward, doubts spread quietly. Would the attack still surprise the enemy? Had the delay been noticed? Would they arrive too late? Some officers urged caution. They argued for halting, regrouping, reconsidering. But the decision had already been made. Washington rode with the men, sharing their conditions, exposed to the same wind and sleet. He did not order the march from a warm tent or a distant headquarters. He moved with the column visible, present, committed. At one point, concern was raised again about the muskets. The response was brief and decisive. If the guns failed, the bayonet would decide the day. It was not bravado. It was acceptance of reality. By the time the outskirts of Trenton came into view, the storm had begun to lift, but the cost was evident. The men were drained. Many could barely feel their hands. Some stumbled from fatigue. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the morning. They were hours late. And yet, the town ahead showed no signs of alarm, no drums, no mustering troops, no defensive preparations. Against expectation, surprise remained intact. The moment of decision had arrived. In the space of a single night, an army on the verge of dissolution had crossed a frozen river, marched through a storm, and reached its objective not because success was assured, but because failure was no longer acceptable. What followed would last less than 2 hours. But everything past and future now depended on those minutes. The attack began not with a single dramatic moment, but with movement. As the American columns approached Trenton from opposite directions, the town still appeared unaware. Windows were dark, streets were quiet. There were no sentries sounding alarms, no formations assembling in haste. For a garrison trained to expect warning before engagement, the absence of preparation was itself a vulnerability. The first shots were fired by American artillery. Cannon had been brought forward and positioned to dominate the main streets, an unconventional but devastating choice. When the guns opened fire, the effect was immediate. The narrow roads of Trenton, never intended for battlefield maneuver, amplified the chaos. Smoke filled the streets. Echoes bounced between buildings. Visibility collapsed. For the Hessian soldiers, trained to fight in open formations, the environment was disorienting. Orders were difficult to hear. Units struggled to assemble. Drums that would normally regulate movement were drowned out by artillery fire. This was not how European warfare was supposed to unfold. The Hessian commander, Colonel Johann Rall, reacted quickly but under impossible conditions. He attempted to gather his men and form a defensive line, but the town itself worked against him. Each attempt to organize was met with concentrated fire. American cannons fired down the length of the streets, turning Trenton into a funnel of destruction. Infantry advanced behind the guns, pressing forward steadily rather than rushing headlong. What mattered most in these moments was timing. The Americans did not need flawless coordination. They needed to maintain pressure long enough to prevent the Hessians from regaining structure. Every delay favored the defenders. Every minute without organization favored the attackers. Rahl attempted to break out of the town. It was a rational decision. Staying within the streets meant being exposed to artillery. If his forces could regroup outside Trenton, the balance might shift. Hessian discipline, once restored, could still prevail. But the American columns had anticipated this move. As Hessian units attempted to maneuver, they found their routes blocked. The two American columns, having entered from different directions, closed the exits. What began as confusion turned into containment. This was not a slaughter. It was not chaotic violence. It was pressure. Steady, controlled, relentless pressure. Hessian resistance stiffened briefly in several locations, but without cohesion, those efforts faded. Small groups fought stubbornly, only to realize they were isolated. Ammunition dwindled. Command signals failed. Rahl himself was wounded while attempting to rally his men. Mortally injured, he was carried from the field, leaving the garrison without centralized leadership at the moment it needed it most. Once command collapsed, the outcome became inevitable. Within roughly 90 minutes of the first engagement, organized resistance ended. Hundreds of Hessian soldiers laid down their arms. Others fled into the surrounding countryside, pursued only briefly. The numbers were striking. Nearly 900 Hessians were taken prisoner. American losses were astonishingly low. No soldiers killed in combat, only a handful wounded, and 2 lost to exposure. But the true significance of the battle was not measured in casualties. It was measured in perception. For the first time, the Continental Army had not merely survived a confrontation with professional European troops. It had defeated them decisively, in open battle, under conditions of its own choosing. Equally important was what did not happen. There was no breakdown in discipline among the American troops. No uncontrolled looting, no collapse into disorder. The Army conducted itself as a professional force, collecting prisoners, securing supplies, and preparing to move. Washington did not linger. He understood that victory created vulnerability as well as opportunity. British forces were nearby. Prolonged occupation would invite counterattack. The objective had never been to hold Trenton. The objective had been to change the course of the war. As prisoners were assembled and captured weapons secured, orders were issued to prepare for withdrawal. By early afternoon, the Army was already moving back toward the Delaware River. The battle was over, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. What had taken less than 2 hours to achieve would reshape the psychology of an entire conflict. An army that had been retreating for months now carried proof, visible, undeniable proof, that the enemy was not invincible. And for the men who had crossed a frozen river the night before, the meaning was simpler and more immediate. They had endured the worst. They had taken the risk. And they had won. In the next section, we will follow what happened after the fighting stopped, why Washington chose withdrawal over pursuit, and how a single victory, carefully preserved, became the foundation for everything that followed. Washington understood something that many commanders learned too late. A battlefield victory does not end danger, it often creates it. By midday on December 26th, Trenton was firmly under American control. Prisoners had been disarmed. Weapons and supplies were collected. The town, momentarily stunned, was quiet again. But the strategic situation had not magically changed. British forces remained nearby. Experienced commanders would soon react. Roads that had carried Hessian troops could just as easily carry British regulars. And the Continental Army, despite its success, was still exhausted, undersupplied, and dangerously exposed. To remain in Trenton would be to invite destruction. Washington resisted the temptation that has undone many victorious armies, the temptation to linger, to consolidate, to celebrate. He had not come to occupy territory. He had come to restore momentum, and momentum, he knew, was fragile. Orders were issued to prepare for immediate withdrawal. The prisoners, hundreds of them, were marched back toward the river. Captured arms and equipment followed. The army moved quickly but deliberately, maintaining order even as fatigue pressed in. The return crossing of the Delaware was as difficult as the first. The weather had not improved. Ice still drifted in the current. The men were colder, weaker, more exhausted than before. Yet morale had changed completely. For the first time in months, the army was not retreating under pressure. It was withdrawing by choice, carrying evidence of victory with it. This distinction mattered. By nightfall, the Continental Army was back on the Pennsylvania side of the river. Trenton, briefly taken, was left behind. The battlefield was abandoned, but not the achievement. Washington had accomplished exactly what he intended. He had proven that the British system could be disrupted, that professional troops could be surprised, that discipline, leadership, and timing could overcome material disadvantages. And most importantly, he had preserved his army. News of the victory traveled faster than the army itself. In towns and villages across the colonies, reports spread with a speed born of hunger for good news. Details were imperfect, numbers were exaggerated, but the core fact was unmistakable. The Continental Army had crossed a river in winter and defeated an enemy garrison. For civilians who had watched the war drift steadily toward collapse, this was more than a military event. It was psychological proof that resistance still had meaning. Men whose enlistments were set to expire reconsidered their decisions. Some stayed. Others re-enlisted only briefly, but long enough to keep the army intact. The hemorrhaging slowed. In some places it stopped. Confidence, once broken, does not return all at once. But Trenton changed the direction of its movement. Within the British command structure, the reaction was sharp and immediate. What had been assumed to be a dying rebellion had demonstrated unexpected capacity for coordination and initiative. Winter quarters were no longer secure. The assumption that Washington would simply endure the cold had been disproven. British forces began to reposition. Units were recalled. Attention shifted from consolidation back to active operations. The war had entered a new phase. Washington did not allow the moment to pass unused. Within days he would strike again, this time at Princeton, exploiting confusion and overconfidence before the British command could fully adjust. These actions, taken together, would later be remembered as the 10 crucial days, not because they ended the war, but because they prevented it from ending too soon. Measured purely in military terms, the Battle of Trenton was small. The forces involved were limited. The casualties were low. No territory changed hands permanently. No capital was captured. No enemy army was destroyed. And yet, historians have consistently identified Trenton as one of the most important engagements of the American Revolutionary War. The reason lies not in scale, but in timing. Trenton occurred at the moment when failure would have been decisive, when the army was at its weakest, when belief was at its lowest, when continuation itself was in doubt. The victory did not guarantee independence, but it preserved the possibility of independence. It bought time for the army to survive the winter, time for leadership to consolidate authority, time for foreign observers to reconsider American potential, time for a fragile revolution to become durable. Washington's gamble succeeded, not because it was flawless, but because it was calibrated to reality. He did not attempt more than his army could sustain. He did not confuse bravery with recklessness. He understood that survival, not domination, was the immediate objective. That understanding, rare under pressure, would define his leadership throughout the war. The story of Trenton is often told as a tale of daring, and it was daring. But its deeper lesson lies elsewhere. It reminds us that history is not shaped only by strength or numbers or inevitability. It is shaped by decisions made when outcomes are uncertain, information is incomplete, and failure carries real consequences. The American Revolution did not survive because victory was guaranteed. It survived because, at its weakest point, its leaders chose to act. If this story resonated with you, if you value history not as mythology, but as a record of human judgment under pressure, then continue with us. Subscribe, follow, and stay engaged as we explore the moments where the past almost went another way and why it didn't. Because understanding how history was saved helps us understand what it costs to preserve it.